Okay, in this video, we're going to talk about cultural relativism, or indeed Gensler's objections to cultural relativism. And I suppose before we start talking about those objections, it's worth just making sure that we have a good understanding of what cultural relativism is in the first place. So let's try to understand cultural relativism. Normally, I'll just note, normally I tell people in my live lectures that my handwriting is really, really bad and just stop me and ask me if you can't read it. I suppose if you really can't read it, you might just back up the video and look again, see if you can understand it. And if not, send me a screenshot of it and I'll tell you what it says. Okay. Okay, so cultural relativism. What is this? Well, it begins with this basic idea. It's not a crazy idea, right? It's worth noting. There aren't a lot of things that I'm going to try to convince you of in this class, but one of them is I will try to convince you that cultural relativism is false. Mostly because the class is predicated on the idea that it's false, right? But the idea is not crazy, even though I think it's false. It begins with this sort of thing to note, right? Is that moral beliefs vary. And they vary both by time and by place, right? So let's think just first about how they've varied by time, right? So let's just first look at moral beliefs in the United States, right? Go back 200 years, right, to 1821, right? Slavery was still legal. There was a growing number of people that were objecting to it, but it was still around. Women were not allowed to vote. They weren't really allowed to do much in the public square. There's all sorts of beliefs that have massively changed since the 1820s, right? And moral beliefs, right? Expectations about how to live morally, how to live a good life, right? So they definitely varied by time, and we can see that they currently vary by place, right? So even within 2021, if you travel around the world, you'll find different moral expectations about what is okay, what is acceptable, what's not acceptable. Imagine the different mores that exist, different rules that exist in different parts of the world, right? Okay, so moral beliefs vary by both time and place, right? A second point is it's not clear how to resolve disagreements. Right? It's not clear how to resolve disagreements without just absolutely, definitely being biased towards your own beliefs, right? How do I know that my beliefs are better off than those of 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, right? How do I know that without already preferring or biasing the beliefs that I happen to have, right? How do I know that my moral beliefs are better than those of someone in, China or Africa or Australia or wherever, right? How do I do that without preferring the beliefs that I already happen to hold? It's not clear, right? And this sort of goes back to the previous video, which is the values that we have are sort of inherent in us. They're sort of stuck in us, right? We can't really escape our values and just evaluate the world, it's in the term evaluate, right? We can't do that without our values, right? We can't escape. We can't get like a God's eye view of the universe and sort of see what the right ethical views should be. And so since it's not clear how we could possibly resolve these disagreements, the conclusion oftentimes is that, well, it turns out that morality is probably just a product of culture. That is to say, the moral beliefs that you happen to hold tend to be determined by the time that you happen to live and the place that you happen to live, right? And now that's not to say that moral beliefs will be a monolith within any culture or society or time, right? Of course, there's tons of moral disagreement within the United States in 2021, right? There's plenty of that. But it does mean that those beliefs of the broader society right now influence the beliefs that we happen to have, right? Okay. That would be what cultural relativism says, right? And the term relativism is a good clue or hint here. it would suggest that morality is relative, hence the term relativism, to culture, right? So the culture that you happen to find yourself in is the one that determines your moral beliefs, right? So it turns out that on a cultural relativist point of view, what is good is really what is approved by the majority within your society, right? Your society is really the ultimate arbiter, the ultimate decider about what is good and bad moral behavior, what good ethical behavior would be and what bad ethical behavior would be. Okay. Gensler, like me, thinks that this is false, right? And you don't have to agree with me, but I'm going to try to convince you as best as I can that it's false. And the reason that I want to convince you that it's false is because if we're cultural relativists, then we might as well do like a public polling instead of ethics, right? Like, if we're cultural relativists, then our society determines what is ethical and good and right, not arguments, right? And this class is going to be focused on arguments about what is good and right and wrong, right? That's where we're going to focus. If we were cultural relativists, then we should probably just take a class on how to poll people really well, right? How to make really, really good surveys. And then we could come to clear ethical beliefs. Hence why I want to try to show you that it's false. But again, if you think it's true, then that's your prerogative to hold that view. I'm not trying to force you to hold a particular view. But Gensler raises several interesting arguments against cultural relativism that I think are actually fairly compelling, fairly convincing, right? So the first one is what he calls the problem of disagreement. Or at least what I call the problem of disagreement. The idea is that... I bought an easel with a whiteboard to do these lectures this summer, and I'm getting used to it, as you can clearly see. Okay, the problem of disagreement is this. It says that if cultural relativism is true, then our society is right about ethics. But that seems weird because we all, probably all of us, hold some ethical view, some moral view, some view that's not in line with the broader society, right? So that says we disagree with society. That seems problematic, though, right? If we're sincerely cultural relativists, then we would just say, well, whatever the society believes, that's what ethics is, right? I guess, there would be no point in disagreeing with your society. Disagreeing with your society would be silly, right? You would just, you'd just say, well, I guess, society's right, right? But it seems like we do oftentimes have sincere moral disagreements with our society. Think about some of the important movements over the course of history, right? The civil rights movement is a great example of this, where there had to be disagreement with the broader sentiments within society to help bring about something that was good and just and right? Which is, equal civil rights for people of color, right? So we have to be able to explain how it is that someone can disagree with their society about ethics, right? And if we're cultural relativists, then that disagreement is weird and strange and really difficult to understand, okay? So that's Gensler's first objection, the problem of disagreement, as he calls it. The second is the problem of tolerance. Gensler, like me, like basically everybody, thinks tolerance is really good and important. And indeed, he thinks that probably the reason why a lot of people want to be cultural relativists is because they care a lot about tolerance, right? And tolerance, of course, is the idea that we should be willing to accept lots of different ideas within our own society, and that we shouldn't, remove someone from our society or disallow someone just because they have different beliefs from us, right? Well, lots of people probably are cultural relativists because they care a lot about tolerance, right? They don't want people removed from our society, removed from the public world because of the beliefs that they happen to hold, right? But as Gensler rightly points out, right, If cultural relativism is true, if CR, cultural relativism, is true, then a society which is intolerant is just as ethical as one which is tolerant. Well, let me just read that again. So if cultural relativism is true, then a society which is intolerant, right, that doesn't accept people with different beliefs, is just as ethical as one which is intolerant. Why would that be the case? Well, if all that you need in order to figure out what your morals, what your ethics are, is just the majority, the broader part of a society accepts it, then if that broader part of a society happens to be intolerant, then they're right? That would just follow from what cultural relativism is. So in some way, if your motivation, if you have this internal urge that you're like, well, maybe cultural relativism is true, and your goal is, the reason you want to say that is because you think you're worried about tolerance, well, it turns out that cultural relativism could defeat tolerance, right? If we're not careful. It could easily sort of, you could have societies that are not tolerant, and that's the end of the game, right? They're right about that, right? There's no way to go appeal to a society which is intolerant and say, you got to change your ways for ethical reasons because they're being ethical, right, according to the definition. Okay, the third one is the problem. Can you still read this? Okay, good. Problem of moral education. And I'll just let you write some notes yourself on the bottom here, and I'll tell this in the context of my own children, right? I have a 2.5-year-old right now who's starting to understand what he's doing. So just yesterday, he kicked his sister, his little sister, who's 10, almost 11 months old. Like toddlers do, right? And of course, I, warned him once when he gave her sort of a soft kick, and I warned her and said, no, we don't kick people. And then he did it again, and I put him in timeout, and, it was sort of a big ordeal. He got very, very upset and was crying really hard, and it was pretty sad, actually. But, part of why I do that is because I think that I need to raise my children to be ethical, good people, right? And one of the things that ethical, good people do or don't do is kick people, right? They don't kick people, that is. And so it's important for me to educate him in this way, right? Now, what's interesting is if I were a cultural relativism or a cultural relativist, or if cultural relativism were true, then I would just tell my son and my daughter eventually, I would just say, do whatever your friends are doing, right? Do what the broader society's doing, right? And this goes directly against the advice that my mom always tells me, right? Well, if everybody did it, would you do it too? I actually don't know if my mom's ever said that, but it's a trope that moms say things like that. We oftentimes think that what we need to teach our children to be able to do is to resist the broader pushes of society, right? To go against the mainstream, right? To be willing to say, no, that's wrong, right? If they found themselves in like Nazi Germany, right? If they, got time traveled there, right? Or if something bad were happening in the U.S., to stand up against it, right? And to call it out. Okay, this wouldn't make sense if we're cultural relativists. Why would we educate our children to be willing to go against society if we think that what at the end of the day, society just determines what's good and just and right? Okay, I'm going to erase here. One more problem, and then a couple other things to note. Another problem is what I'll call the problem of many societies. As Gensler rightly points out, none of us is a member of a single monolith of a society, right? Society is made up of tons of groups, and as individual human beings, we find ourselves in members of many different sub-societies within a group, right? So, for example, you're probably a member of, you're a member of the Morningside community, at least for this summer. You are possibly a member of a sports team. You're a member of a state, of a city, of a country, of a region. You maybe are a member of a church or other clubs or groups, right? A family. There's all these different societies or society-esque sorts of things into which you're a part. And what's important about that is we are all members of many societies, and those many societies often disagree with one another. What my family believes might disagree with what my state believes, which might disagree with what my athletic team thinks, and so on and so forth, right? And so the question is, which one is the culture to which I am relative, to which my moral beliefs are relative, and how do we figure that out? Well, it turns out that if we're members of these many societies, there's no obvious and clear way to resolve those disagreements, right? At least not if we think that culture determines our moral beliefs, right? Or ought to determine our moral beliefs. Okay. The last thing I want to note then before ending this video here is the other thing that Gensler does, and I think he does a pretty good job of this, is he says, look, there's all these motivations why people want to be moral relativists. I mentioned earlier the desire for tolerance, right? Seems to be one of them. Or just the recognition that moral beliefs are variant across time and space. He says, a lot of times people say, well, what I want is... one of the reasons why they might think that cultural relativism is true is because they say, well, look at science, right? Science is like cold, hard facts, right? Whereas morality seems to vary with time and place, with culture, right? Whereas science doesn't, like 9.8 meters per second squared is 9.8 meters per second squared. It doesn't matter really where you are, right? Neglecting air pressure and stuff like that, and distance from the center of the earth. But, the idea being that, science is based on facts. It doesn't vary with time and place, even if our beliefs about it does, whereas ethics does seem to have this problem. Well, as he rightly points out, science is a product of culture, right? It requires culture, and indeed, as a philosopher of science, I can tell you, there are all sorts of ways in which science is not this cold hard domain of facts, right? That's indisputable and has never been wrong and will never be wrong or changed, so on and so forth, right? Note that just because there's disagreement, right? That's also not a reason to be a cultural relativist, right? We disagree about things all the time. In fact, going back to science, right? There's tons of disagreement in science, right? What's a scientific journal apart from a recording of a ton of people disagreeing with each other, right? More or less, right? And then there's also the reality that there are some things for which there are true answers, but we cannot resolve. We can't know them. There are certain things that just are beyond our ken, right? So just the fact that we cannot resolve, obviously, the answers to moral questions doesn't show that cultural relativism is true either, right? So Gensler has given us several reasons to think that cultural relativism is false. He's given us those 4 problems. Those are the things that I would really focus on in preparing for the exam. Okay. Until next time. Cheers.